CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Robin Dwyer.
And I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories. Grounding the Airbus-Boeing trade dispute. The EU and US hit cruise control during Biden's visit to Brussels.
France expands its vaccine drive to tweens and teens.
Fan favourites by default. Hungarians pack Puskás Arena for a Euro 2020 match that's allowed to be at capacity. Plus,
I'm Nicole Johnston in southeast England. And coming up, we'll find out why British farmers believe a trade deal with Australia could threaten their way of life.
America is back. With those words, Joe Biden set the tone for his EU summit, sending out a message of Western solidarity. The United States and European Union even resolved a long-running tariff battle that had intensified during his predecessor's tenure.
The tariff truce between the EU and the US ends a 17-year dispute on aircraft subsidies, providing a major boost to transatlantic relations. The two have been battling since 2004 in parallel cases at the World Trade Organization over subsidies for US plane maker Boeing and European rival Airbus. In 2019, the US imposed tariffs on EU imports worth $7.5 billion. The EU hit back the following year with tariffs on US goods worth $4 billion. But in March this year, they agreed to suspend these tariffs for 4 months on goods including EU wine and US tobacco and spirits. The tariffs have now been paused for another 5 years, starting on July the 11th. Well, Philip Crowther joins us now from Brussels. So, Philip, what does this deal mean for the transatlantic relationship?
Well, it improves. It's as simple as that. It improves because Joe Biden, as US president, is a much more popular figure within the European Union, with the European leaders as well, of course, who he met here today in Brussels. The simple absence of Donald Trump as US president, that simply improves the relationship between the European Union and the United States. That much is clear, and that both sides would absolutely agree on that. So the end of this trade dispute, well, it's a start, but it does remind us that there are plenty of very serious unresolved issues still on the table, and they will have to be discussed over the next few months and, well, hopefully not years. That certainly would be the opinion of both parties, because those import taxes on behalf of the United States on European steel and aluminium, they are still in place. They were actually put there by former President Donald Trump, and that was a full 3 years ago. So that is something that the Europeans certainly will want to get rid of. You already mentioned also some of those, well, sometimes you'd think they're rather funny tariffs because they were put on things that have nothing to do with the airline industry. You mentioned, for example, French wine or US bourbon. That was part of the airline tariff dispute, incredibly, but as you mentioned, those have been suspended for quite a while now. Now, one thing also worth mentioning, that as this trade dispute, or at least one part of the trade dispute between the European Union and the United States, seemingly comes to an end, that means that both of them, the EU and the US, will be able to concentrate on another country who they consider a common economic threat, that, of course, being China, a country mentioned so many times by US President Joe Biden during his first trip abroad.
So, Philip, does this deal then mean that the cloud that the dispute left hanging over the airline sector has now lifted?
Well, look, strictly speaking, I'd say it hasn't necessarily on the airline sector, but certainly has on the aircraft sector. But really, of course, the two go hand in hand. It's billions of dollars in punitive tariffs that come to an end with this agreement. It is, though, it must be said, just a suspension. It lasts 5 years and can be reinstated. Now, when we talk about the airline sector, of course, you have to look at the bigger picture as well. It is a part of both the European and the US and indeed the world economy that has suffered so much during the coronavirus pandemic. And that brings us back, of course, to part of those discussions that happened here in Brussels today between the European Union and the United States, and has not come to a resolution. And that is the simple fact that there are still very serious travel restrictions between the European Union and the United States. That, of course, leads to less airline traffic, and that hurts the airline sector. So there's still quite a lot to be done for that particular part of the economy to say they're out of trouble right now.
Philip Crowther in Brussels, thanks very much.
Well, let's get more on this now with Carol Lanoux, who's the CEO of the Centre for European Policy Studies in Brussels. So good to see you, Carol. Is this truce what it seems?
Sorry, I didn't catch your question.
Is this deal, is this truce, is it what it seems, do you think? Is it going to hold?
No, it is extremely important, because you have to remember the last meeting at a top level between the EU and the US was in the summer of 2018, when the former president of the European Commission, Juncker, went to see Trump in the White House. And they concluded an agreement that they would like to have a tariff-free trade between the EU and the US. So that's 3 years ago. And they made one exception, which was cars. If you see until today, like the previous respondent said, there are still many areas where there are substantial tariffs, like, for example, cars. So that 3 years ago commitment, there's still a lot to be done. But on top of that, we had, in the Obama time, we had a commitment to try to form what we call a TTIP, a trade and transatlantic investment partnership, a form of a trade agreement between the EU and the US, like the EU has with Canada, like the EU has with, for example, Japan, a very important agreement, like we're discussing with Australia, like we have with South Korea. But the United States, we do not have any trade agreement. Of course, we speak a lot to each other, and we are extremely important commercial partners to each other, but we do not have a formal trade agreement, nor any form of meeting each other on an annual basis. This meeting, which took place this morning today, was extremely important because it could be the start of a more in-depth trade agreement or a mutual meeting between the EU and the US. And they also agreed to set up a trade and technology council, meaning a regular meeting to discuss these kind of frictions or the different views on trade with each other. In addition, we need to see that the trade surplus with the United States of Europe, of the EU itself, is about 150 billion and has continued to increase all the time. It was something which was a problematic issue for Trump because he said Europe doesn't spend on security. The United States has to defend Europe, but Europe is earning money on us all the time. And basically this trade surplus from Europe in the United States has continued to increase all the time, which means that, for example, if today we export cars to the United States, there is a 5% tariff. But if the US export cars, like Teslas, to Europe, there is a 10% tariff. And there are certainly many other sectors where you have an asymmetry. So there is still a lot which can be done to facilitate trade between the EU and the US. Like, for example, we've done with Canada, where we've concluded an agreement about 3 or 4 years ago, which now already has produced a remarkable increase in trade, as well for goods, as well as for services.
Carol, look, you said there's still a lot to be done, and you're clearly hoping that this truce is going to last for 5 years. But the market's dynamics are changing, and perhaps that's what provided the impetus for this deal. So talk about the competition and what else is out there in the market. How does China fit into the big picture?
Yeah, that's the difficulty. As we've heard, there was another summit here yesterday, which was the NATO summit. And I think one of the main reasons why Biden came to Brussels was to make sure that he could, or the United States could have its China agenda agreed upon by the EU. And basically, the NATO, which is a security arm for Europe, or the transatlantic security arm, agreed that China, not only Russia, but also China is now a systemic rival. Meaning that the United States has a problem with China, which it wants to export to Europe, but Europe has an enormous trade with China, above all Germany. And for example, it's very well known that Germany exports plenty of cars. From every 4 Volkswagens, for example, which are produced, 1 is produced for the Chinese market, which is enormous. So on that issue, we have a more ambivalent position where some countries have come, like Belgium, for example, today, come to say, look, we have adopted a resolution in the Belgian parliament today to say, look, what's happening with the Uyghurs is a genocide. We have to act against China, but not all countries have the same view because they think, look, we need to continue to do trade, which is, of course, the best example of Germany, which, by the way, has a lot of trade with the United States as well. So Europe, at some stage, for the United States, will have to choose what it does with China and whether it wants to have a more restrictive relationship with China than we have for the moment.
Carol Lanu at the Centre for European Policy Studies, thank you.
China has responded to Monday's NATO communique, which labelled its actions as a systemic challenge. Beijing accused NATO of posing a threat to peace and stability through its involvement in many of the world's conflicts. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson said NATO's accusations had been hypocritical.
On the one hand, NATO calls on its member states to increase military spending, requiring their military spending to achieve or exceed 2% of their GDP. On the other hand, NATO makes irresponsible remarks on the modernization of China's national defense and armed forces, which is a typical double standard. In fact, China's military spending only accounts for 1.3% of its GDP, far below NATO's passing line.
The UK and Australia have agreed a free trade deal, the first major deal to be negotiated from scratch since Brexit. It means British products will be cheaper to sell to Australia, while Australian farmers can export to the UK. Let's get more on this with Nicole Johnston. Nicole, good to see you. So how big a deal is this deal for both the UK and Australia?
Well, for the UK, it doesn't have a great deal of impact in terms of its economic value. This is really about symbolism, and as you said, it is the first trade deal from the UK that it's managed to get over the line in this post-Brexit environment, and they've built it from scratch, from the very beginning. They're hoping that this trade deal will then lead to other trade deals with countries around the world. In particular, they want to join this agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would give them trading partners as diverse as Canada, Mexico, and even Japan. So they've really got their eye on the bigger prize. But not everybody is happy with this trade deal, that's for sure, especially British farmers, as you'll see in this report.
In the green fields of Sussex, beef prices are strong and the season looks good, but farmers are worried.
So these are our female cows, so these give birth every year in the spring, so these calves.
David Exwood doesn't know how British farmers will compete with a new tariff-free trade deal between the UK and Australia, even though the British government says it's negotiated a 15-year cap to protect agriculture.
It will threaten to undermine all the great work that British farmers have been doing for biodiversity, carbon, animal welfare by bringing in unlimited amounts of beef and other products from Australia that we can't hope to compete with and could completely undermine our market.
Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison is in London to finalise the deal with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson this week. It's also the British government's first entirely new post-Brexit trade deal. Since leaving the EU, other agreements have been rolled over from previous deals.
We're opening up to each other, and this is the prelude to a general campaign of opening up around the world.
Where you have challenges with one trading partner from time to time, then the ability to be able to diversify your trade into more and more countries is incredibly important. And I genuinely appreciate the way that the UK have engaged in this agreement because it reflects an understanding of that.
One of the concerns of British farmers with the Australian trade deal is that it will threaten their way of life, that corporate-scale farming will undercut the smaller-scale agriculture here and set a precedent with other big producing countries like the US, Brazil and New Zealand. Australia has the market of Asia on its doorstep, so why would it be interested in selling to the UK anyway?
The UK is a really high-value market. We're one of the most valuable food markets in the world, and I don't know any exporter that doesn't want to sell to a high-value market. But also, you know, the world's quite a volatile place. It's entirely likely that Australia or another country might fall out with one of their major exporters over something completely unexpected and look to switch it into somewhere else, you know, and again, with the unlimited, the zero tariff, zero quota, they could suddenly switch a lot of production into the UK, and there's nothing I could do about it.
The British government hopes this will be the start of more international trade deals in the Asia-Pacific. But here in Sussex, Many farmers think the industry could have some challenging years ahead.
Nicole, why does Australia need this market now?
Well, the Australian government and Australian agriculture, I would say, are taking a really long view on this. One of the elements that has been built into this trade deal is a 15-year phase-in period, so things won't dramatically change overnight. But some of the biggest Australian beef exporters have said that eventually they're anticipating that their market to the UK could grow tenfold. And as we just heard there from the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and also from the farmer in Sussex, the other big issue for Australia right now is to try and diversify its market away from Asia and in particular away from China. Now, China and Australia over the last 12 months have been engaged in a serious trade dispute. China has blocked a raft of exports from Australia, everything from lobster to beef. So the Australian government knows that it needs to find friends, allies, and in particular trading partners in alternative markets, and that's why right now Canberra is taking a long view and looking at the UK.
Nicole Johnston, thank you very much.
We heard Nicole there talking about the Australia-China trade relationship, and there are calls now for Australia to salvage those relations with what is its largest trading partner, China. The country's top export state, Western Australia, has urged a reset, calling conflicts counterproductive. Recent tensions over the pandemic, Xinjiang and Hong Kong have strained trade and diplomatic ties. China responded to Australian allegations by imposing tariffs on a range of goods, but it stopped short of including iron ore and liquefied natural gas, Western Australia's top exports.
Still ahead on CGTN, hump back and sides. London's camels get a much-needed makeover.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to the Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire. To bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Welcome back. Remember, CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV. You can also find us on YouTube and Dailymotion, as well, of course, as CGTN.com and the CGTN app.
The US has passed the milestone of 600,000 COVID-19 deaths, according to new figures. However, one Wall Street giant has told staff that from today they must return to the office full-time. John Terrett's in New York with all the latest for us. Hello to you, John. Let's start by talking about the Federal Reserve, though. It begins its two-day rates meeting, always closely watched by analysts. So what signs are they looking for?
Yeah, hey, Robin. Hey, Juliet. Well, you know, first thing I have to say is I think it is highly unlikely that the overnight interest rate is going to be altered. Of course, it could change because we don't actually know, as you well know, because they're in a meeting. They're locked in a room in the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. But I don't think it's going to happen. So what we're looking for really is when Chairman Powell, Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, the central bank, comes out on Wednesday after the meeting over, and we're listening for the tone that he adopts regarding the economy going forward and in particular inflation. And they will also publish something called the Summary of Economic Projections, and that'll be widely read by economists around the world as well. Now, the starting point for this is that we are in the middle of a full-on recovery in the United States and indeed around the world, but especially here in the United States, with the central bank and the Treasury pretty much throwing absolutely everything at the economy, including the kitchen sink and the budgerigar, as you know. And this leads to inflation. Of course it does. Prices going up, which is not something we've really seen terribly much in the last 20 years or so. Now, we have had some record inflation figures in just the last couple of weeks. Back in April and then again in May, we saw record inflation, what they call CPI, which is Consumer Price Index, which is what we pay at the stores. And then today, Tuesday in America, we've seen record PPI, which is producer prices. In other words, what the people who make things that we want to buy, what they have to pay in order to get the stuff to make the things that we want to buy. And that was up 6.6% today. And that, like the CPI last week and in April, is a year-on-year record, never been seen before. But the Federal Reserve says, look, this is all down to supply issues. It's not really transformational. It's transitory. That's the word that they use. In other words, temporary. And they say, look, it's happening because a huge demand coming out of this downturn, and we simply can't get people into jobs fast enough in order to make the things that need to be made. There are bottlenecks. So on Wednesday, we'll be looking for how many times Chairman Powell uses the word transitory. We'll be looking to see whether he is as mixed on his signaling as many economists think he has been regarding tapering the asset buying that's going on, because part of throwing the kitchen sink at it is that they're buying things left, right and centre to prop up various sectors that we won't go into now. That's going to have to end at some point, and there's real pressure, by the way, from overseas banks to start doing that now, which the Fed is ignoring. And most people in New York seem to think that they will wait until September or October to decide whether this inflation that we're experiencing is transformational or whether it really is temporary or not, and then they will make their move. I should remind you, the job of the central bank here, the Federal Reserve, is to get full employment, or as close as they can to it, and to meet their inflation target, which is around 2%. And we're not really there at the moment. So the markets have taken on the sense that this is temporary, and that the inflation issue will not be a problem down the road, although today they are down in advance of the meeting, with the Dow down 0.4%, the Nasdaq 0.6%, the S&P 500, which has had 3 records in a row, Thursday, Friday and Monday, today down by about 0.25%. Robin?
Well, John, I'm sure we'll be talking again tomorrow about this Federal Reserve meeting, but let's go back to that Wall Street giant that is sending staff back to work. That's the bank, Goldman Sachs. And how are staff there responding?
Yeah. Well, this is a very emotional issue. People are pretty upset about this one way and another, and it has certainly piqued interest throughout New York because Goldman Sachs is the first of its kind to really do that, and that is to say to the staff, you have got to come back. And David Solomon, who is the CEO, wants them all back at their desks this week. Now, the staff are unhappy because obviously there are it's the same scenario with getting people into jobs around the country. It's worries about healthcare, worries about childcare, worries about the loss of flexibility that the staff have had because they've been working from home, and many of them have been far more productive. They feel they're going to lose that now because they have the commute to build into their day, and of course a loss of flexibility all round. Now, my understanding is that these flexibility issues have been met by Goldman Sachs, and if people have real problems with coming back to the office, then that will be sorted out. There will certainly be exceptions. It's being done team by team, so not all team members are coming back on the same day at once, and the staff do have to prove their COVID status as they come into the building. I gather there were rather long lines yesterday, Monday, when they came in for the first time, as people had to show that they'd either been vaccinated fully or had not, depending. Now, I will just finish off by saying that Goldman Sachs is not alone in insisting on all of this. Only today we heard from the boss over at Morgan Stanley, one of their great big rivals, another major investment bank. He's called James Gorman. And he said this. He said, look, if you could go to a restaurant in New York, you could come to the office. And even more bluntly than that, he said, if you want New York wages, you've got to come and work in New York. And the feeling among these big banking corporations and many others here as well is that they are face-to-face businesses. They're not FaceTime or Zoom businesses, and they really do want people back at the office. Juliet and Robin.
John, good to talk to you. John Terrett there in New York.
UK unemployment fell for the fourth month in a row in April as lockdown easing continues. The country's jobless rate was 4.7% overall in the 3 months to April, beating expectations. Analysts say demand for new staff in the hospitality sector and from businesses reopening after months of furlough have boosted the figures.
Dubai's government has injected an additional $1.1 billion into its flagship airline, Emirates, after the company reported a $5.5 billion full-year loss on Tuesday. That's compared to a profit of nearly $300 million a year ago. Emirates' revenue plunged 66% following the collapse in long-haul travel due to the pandemic.
The world's second biggest fashion retailer, H&M, has seen its quarterly sales surge more than 60% compared to a year earlier. Analysts say the jump from March to May is a result of restrictions easing worldwide, although revenue remains well below 2019 levels. Around 4,000 H&M stores were forced to close last year due to COVID-19 lockdowns.
Swedish retail giant IKEA has been fined over $1 million by a French court for spying on its staff. Lawyers claim the firm's French subsidiary illegally accessed workers' bank and car details and compiled fraudulent staff reports. IKEA was also found to have paid for access to police files on some workers over a 3-year period from 2009.
UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson says thousands of people might have died from the COVID-19 Delta variant if he hadn't delayed England's lockdown easing. The lifting of restrictions will now be put back by a month to July the 19th, while the country's vaccination programme will be accelerated. It comes as new data shows vaccines made by Pfizer and AstraZeneca offer more than 90% protection against hospitalisation.
France has started giving coronavirus jabs to teenagers as it ramps up its vaccination campaign. 12 to 17-year-olds can now be inoculated, but under strict conditions, as Ross Cullen explains.
Another milestone for the COVID-19 vaccination campaign in France, children getting their coronavirus shots for the first time. The move is being strictly controlled. Vaccinations can only be given with the child's consent, their parents' oral and written consent, and if the jab takes place in the presence of the child's parents.
C'est pas trop tôt, et c'est pas trop tard.
It's not too early nor too late. I think it's good. I am myself vaccinated. Maybe my son is immune, but I think it is good. We have a pass to travel now. This could be a pass to get back to almost normal and be more serene. If my son wants to get vaccinated, I am all for it.
I think it's a good thing, and as soon as I can get vaccinated, I will do it. That would reassure me, and I'll be able to do more things.
France has gone from the problems of the sluggish rollout of vaccines at the start of the year to being one of the first countries to offer jabs to children.
We saw some teenagers who want to be vaccinated with the understanding that they would like their college or their high school to not be closed next year. They also want to be able to go on holiday more freely. And several spoke spontaneously about collective immunity.
All those youngsters who do receive a dose will get the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, which was approved by Europe's drugs regulator last month for use in 12 to 15-year-olds.
The government wants to continue to drive uptake of the vaccine across the population to try to mirror the unlocking strategy and to combat the clusters of the Delta variant we are starting to see here.
As France progressively expands its vaccination campaign, it's also progressively lifting the remaining restrictions in place. hoping for a safe, successful summer season without a subsequent surge in cases in September. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy is back in court, charged with illegally financing his failed 2012 re-election campaign. The case was postponed in March after a defence lawyer contracted COVID-19. Sarkozy was president from 2007 to 2012. He was convicted of corruption in a separate case earlier this year.
Still ahead, Geneva puts up the barricades, but can Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin mend fences when they meet on Wednesday?
More than 100,000 people in Italy have now died from COVID-19.
The vaccination programme offers some hope for the future, but intensive care units are near capacity.
The Spanish government is hoping to vaccinate over 1 million people by next month.
Living in Germany are struggling with their mental health.
Hungary is supplementing the EU's vaccine rollout, buying doses from Russia and China to speed up the process.
4 million people have tested positive in France.
After a grim winter, the promise of a spring bloom that could mean freedom for millions.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time has come, and this idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Juliet Mann and me, Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Europe and the US shelve a long-running trade battle as Joe Biden meets EU leaders in Brussels.
The UK and Australia strike a trade deal, but British farmers are worried they'll be undercut.
And France is expanding its vaccine drive. 12 to 17-year-olds can now get their first jab.
The wait for one of the most highly anticipated face-to-face meetings of the year is nearly over. US President Joe Biden will meet his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, in Geneva on Wednesday. The lakeside Swiss city has been preparing for weeks. Security is tight and it's almost completely shut down for the summit. But Tony Waterman managed to squeeze through and she's there for us now. Tony, good to see you. A highly anticipated meeting. What's the mood like on the ground?
Well, on this side of Lake Geneva, it looks like any other late, warm summer evening. You have a lot of people walking around, jogging, exercising, riding their bicycle, playing with their kids. But if you were to go across Lake Geneva to the other side, to Parc de la Grange, it's a different story. It's inside that park, which you might be able to faintly see over my shoulder here. It's inside that park in an 18th century villa where this meeting is going to be taking place. That park has been closed for about 10 days now. They've been sprucing up the mansion, sprucing up the grounds in anticipation. Outside, there is barbed wire and ring fence for as long as the eye can see. Troops and police have been deployed, thousands of them, 3,500 will be protecting that area alone tomorrow. Also, the airspace is being limited at the moment, and come the early hours of tomorrow morning, this whole area where I am standing right now, included over down here where the boats are, around the entire lake. This entire area is going to be closed to the public. No pedestrians, no vehicles, and no boats crossing the lake here. And we have seen that the security has gotten tighter in just the last couple of hours here because U.S. President Joe Biden is now on the ground. He arrived earlier. We actually saw his plane coming in over Lake Geneva. He is here for the night. That meeting is going to start with the Russian president tomorrow midday. And my colleague Julia Chapman has this preview on what is expected to be discussed.
President Vladimir Putin likes having a seat at the table. The next one will be with his U.S. counterpart, Joe Biden. With relations at a historic low, the Russian president says he wants to improve ties with Washington.
We have no disagreements with the United States. They only have one disagreement. They want to stifle our development. They talk about it publicly. Everything else derives from that. Economic restrictions and attempts to influence our internal political processes at home by relying on powers they regard as their own.
The White House takes a different view. It has promised President Biden will raise concerns about human rights, allegations of hacking, and the Russian government's pressure on opposition groups. The meeting comes at a diplomatic low point, with both countries' ambassadors recalled.
Russian officials have warned Washington to expect uncomfortable signals ahead of the meeting, but the Kremlin says no topic will be off limits.
For the two Cold War adversaries, strategic stability is the priority for these talks. Under President Donald Trump, the U.S. withdrew from several arms control pacts. Russia is hoping for more predictability with his successor.
If the Kremlin judges Biden to be a serious counterpart, genuinely interested in a more stable relationship with Russia, and able to understand Russia's security needs, that will be seen as a successful outcome. If, however, this boils down to a litany of American complaints, charges, accusations, and stuff like that, not really balanced by an agreement to start strategic stability dialogue, then this would not be regarded as very successful.
Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden have met before, when Biden was vice president. This time, nobody has illusions of a Russia-US reset. Nevertheless, the first talks between these two presidents will reopen dialogue between the world's biggest nuclear powers. Julia Chapman, CGTN, Moscow.
Diplomats from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization are laying out plans to enhance regional integration and stability. They're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the SCO, which is made up of 8 countries in the Eurasian region. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi says the group has come a long way, and he reaffirms China's support for the bloc's further growth.
As a founding member of the SCO, China has always taken the SCO as a diplomatic priority. In recent years, President Xi Jinping, together with leaders of the other SCO member states, has drawn up a blueprint for the SCO's development, putting forward major initiatives that will benefit the people of all countries, adding new meaning to the Shanghai spirit and charting the course for the health and steady development of the SCO. Standing at a new historical starting point, the SCO should stand ahead of the times, shoulder our responsibilities and make greater contributions to world peace and development.
Joining us now is Andrei Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. Thanks very much indeed for being with us on the programme today. So we've heard from NATO in recent days talking of its concerns about Russia and China, both SCO countries. Do you think this will drive closer cooperation between the two?
Well, as far as Russia and China is concerned, no doubt that they will get closer to each other. But it's not that clear whether SCO can become a kind of anti-Western alliance, because SCO is not an alliance of like-minded countries. We do have Russia and China there, but we also have a country like India, which has very different views on the world, on the West and on the United States.
So do you think the SCO stands as an alternative to NATO?
Well, I think that it would be probably an over-exaggeration. SCO is still a teenager in the world of international organizations. It turned 20, but it still has to mature. But SCO now has got a unique chance to demonstrate that it might do better than NATO did in Afghanistan. It's a formidable challenge for SCO, and if it stands up to this challenge, it will prove its maturity.
So what does the SCO bring when it comes to addressing international issues, like in Afghanistan, for example? How valuable is its different perspective?
I think that definitely SCO has a flexibility, probably more flexibility than NATO. It can combine the security agenda and the development agenda. It also might try to go for lowest common denominators on certain issues. But I wouldn't over-exaggerate the influence of SCO, since indeed it's an institution with very different countries involved, and in a way it is still looking for its mission.
So it's marking 20 years, the SCO. What role does it have to play today, do you think, and what role has it played in the past?
Well, it started as a rather modest initiative. The goal was to fix remaining border problems between China on the one hand and a number of post-Soviet republics on the other. Then ambitions started to grow. At some point, they thought that SCO might become a free trade zone for Eurasia. But of course, this idea turned out to be a stillborn, because everybody was afraid of China taking the upper hand. They also thought about a more security-driven agenda for SCO, but with India and Pakistan on board, it's very difficult to turn SCO into something more than a club of big Eurasian countries. So there are some limitations on what SCO can do, but since it's a very diverse institution, I think it might still have a lot of future.
Andrei Kortunov from the Russian International Affairs Council, thanks very much indeed for giving us your thoughts today.
Thank you.
Families of people killed during a crackdown on drug dealing in the Philippines have welcomed plans for an investigation by the International Criminal Court. ICC prosecutors say they want to look into possible crimes against humanity. The probe will cover a 3-year period under President Rodrigo Duterte up to March 2019. Thousands of civilians died, with many accusing state forces of carrying out extrajudicial killings.
At least 20 military trainees are thought to have died in a suicide bomb attack in the Somali capital, Mogadishu. The bomber targeted a military facility as hundreds of new recruits lined up for training. Authorities say no group has yet claimed responsibility.
Ryanair says it does not support a ban on Belarusian airspace in the long term. The airline is instead calling for assurances that there'll be no repeat of last month's forced landing when Belarus diverted a plane to Minsk before arresting a journalist who was on board. Belarusian carriers are now banned from flying over EU and UK territory.
Radiation levels around the Taishan nuclear plant are normal, according to Chinese officials. The plant's French co-owner says it's working to resolve a performance issue linked to a gas build-up at the facility in southeast Guangdong province. Water testing is also being carried out in neighbouring Hong Kong, with no radiation rise detected so far.
Israelis can stop wearing masks indoors after the government ended one of its last main coronavirus restrictions. New COVID infections are dropping in the country. Masks will still remain compulsory for anyone who hasn't been vaccinated, along with all passengers on commercial flights.
Tensions are high in East Jerusalem as Israeli nationalists gather for a controversial march around the occupied Palestinian territory. Now, these are live pictures of the so-called March of the Flags, which celebrates the anniversary of Israel's 1967 occupation of the area. Palestinians have been forcibly removed from Damascus Gate leading to the Old City. But unlike previous years, the march will not enter through the gate into the Muslim quarter. Palestinians view this march as provocative, saying Israeli settlers are flaunting their sovereignty over the occupied territory.
Coming up, Ronaldo has a fizzy fit, going sour on a soda giant at Euro 2020.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. In Mexico, sports fans are going back to stadiums for the first time since the start of the pandemic.
More than half of the country's states have been rated green, with COVID caseloads at low levels. Alistair Baverstock reports from Mexico City.
A home run for the home team sends the crowd wild as Mexico City's Diablos Rojos take on their fiercest rivals. This is Mexico's equivalent of a New York Yankees-Boston Red Sox baseball game, and for the first time since March 2020, the players are doing it in front of a live audience. The fans are just as happy to be back.
We love baseball and this is our team, so we're very excited.
This is one of a series of trial large public events around Mexico as this country attempts to return to normal.
Mexico City has now returned to green on the country's stoplight-style pandemic protocols map, along with 18 other Mexican states, allowing life to return more or less to normal.
Yet welcoming fans back hasn't been easy. Mexico still lags behind when it comes to vaccines, and every precaution must be taken. Indeed, for the stadium's health director, reopening to the public is the culmination of a lot of work.
We had taken a month and a half to prepare the stadium for this event. People were very nervous at first, but they take confidence when they see how seriously we are taking it, and their respectful collaboration has been vital in making this work.
As the home team crushes their rivals 18-2 for their general manager, it's all thanks to the fans.
It simply isn't baseball without the fans. Professional athletes are like any other performer. They feed on the reactions of the crowd. So having the public back with us is essential for the team.
As Mexico tries to return to normal public life, it's events like this that will pave the way to a post-pandemic reality. Alistair Baverstock, CGTN, Mexico City.
Some news from Euro 2020 now, and Denmark's Christian Eriksen says he feels fine under the circumstances following his cardiac arrest on Saturday. He collapsed just before half-time during a match against Finland. He was rushed to hospital after receiving CPR on the pitch. Eriksson thanked fans for their messages and support and says he can't wait to cheer on Denmark in the rest of the tournament.
Portuguese football superstar Cristiano Ronaldo has let fizzy drink giant Coca-Cola go flat during a Euro 2020 pre-match press conference. And it's not because he's a Pepsi fan either. The team's captain removed 2 bottles from in front of him and then, with disdain, exclaimed, "Drink water." Coca-Cola is an official sponsor of the tournament.
Ronaldo's team are on the pitch playing Hungary right now. Tens of thousands of football fans have packed into Budapest Puskás Stadium, the only venue allowing full capacity for European Championship matches. Hungary's capital is hosting 4 Euros games, allowing all 67,000 seats to be filled, but with strict entry requirements for spectators. Most host cities have limited ticket sales to less than 45% capacity due to coronavirus restrictions. Well, Penelope Liesch is in Budapest for us. So, Penelope, what's the atmosphere like?
Well, Robin, unfortunately, it has just hit half-time, so you can hear a bit of the atmosphere behind us of 67,000 people crammed into Puskás Stadium. But in the last few minutes, we've just heard cheers and cheers, the crowd continuing to get to their feet throughout this game. Now, it's majority of Hungarian fans in there, but some Portuguese supporters as well, and they are elated to be back at live sport and to be part of this Euro campaign in a full capacity crowd. Now, it really is quite remarkable to see Budapest hosting this many people and hosting a 100% full capacity stadium when only 2 months ago the country was recording the highest number of daily COVID deaths in the world. We saw in the last few hours, as fans started to enter the stadium, tens of thousands of people all marching together, all chanting, all letting off fans, a complete football mania and Euro fever taking over Budapest as fans travelled together as one towards the stadium. Really, looking at them travelling together, you wouldn't know it was still the middle of a pandemic. It could have been 2 years earlier, the closest that Hungary and many places in Europe have seen to a normal event in quite some time. But it was up to the host cities to decide how many people they would allow into their stadiums. Budapest, the only one, as you said, to go for 100% capacity. The next closest is around 50%. So a really ambitious play by the Hungarian government, who are huge football fans. Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister, a very big supporter of Hungarian football, and it was a high priority for the government to get this event up and running to the highest capacity that they could. But certainly, speaking to locals, the majority of fans very, very happy to have this event in their backyard, many going to the games, if not still thinking it's a great thing for Hungarian sport to put them on the map with this kind of live event. However, there are some locals who say they will be staying away because of COVID risks, and public health experts, they're not on board. We've spoken to a public health expert who advises the Mayor of Budapest. He's told us he sees this as a very high-risk move by the government, that in some ways it was a little shameful that the Hungarian government had gone for such a big capacity in their stadium compared to other host cities, and it will be in the next weeks and months that we really see the COVID data come through to see what the effect of hosting these 4 matches to 100% capacity really means for Hungary. But it certainly is the biggest event that they've faced and the biggest test since the pandemic began.
Penelope Liesch in Budapest, thanks very much indeed.
Scientists are exploring why grey whales are dying off the Pacific coast of the Americas. The mammals usually stock up on fat reserves over the summer, but many are now ending the season in poor health. CGTN's Shini Samara reports.
In the spring of 2019, an unusually high number of grey whales were washed up on the eastern Pacific coast of Mexico, the USA and Canada, either dead or dying. They didn't show any signs of having been caught in fishing nets, nor have biologists found any signs of a toxic spill or outbreak of disease that would account for their deaths. They had simply left their breeding grounds in Mexico and never made it back to their feeding grounds in the Arctic.
So why were the whales dying? Assistant Professor Fredrik Christiansen and his team had secured funding in 2017 to study these whales, particularly their migratory patterns, so they were in a unique position to help solve this mystery.
We don't know that much about whales and like what's called bioenergetics. So it's basically like how much energy do they require to to function, how much energy does it cost them to grow, how much does it cost to reproduce and to survive, and so on.
Professor Christensen has been using drone technology to measure the bioenergetics of whales in a non-invasive way.
We just fly this over the whales at maybe 20-30 meters altitude. It has a camera on board that we face directly down in a perfect 90-degree angle. So we can measure from the photographs the number of pixels, that's the length of the whale, and the width of the whale. We can actually convert these pixel measurements to actual meters. So we can measure how long the whale is and how wide it is. And from that we can calculate its volume. And by looking at the volume relative to how long the animal is, we get a metrics or kind of an index of how fat the animal is. Most of these species spend half the year feeding in one location, normally close to the polar regions. And then they use all this energy, they build up these fat reserves that they then carry with them to the breeding grounds during the winter. And during that time, they're not feeding at all. So for them, having really a lot of fat is essential for their reproduction and their survival. And we can identify the animals from the color patterns on their backs. So by doing that, we can actually monitor the same individual, photograph the same animal over time, and measure how its condition changes.
But over the 4 years of monitoring, something shocking was revealed.
We can see a trend in how the population condition changes over the time. All the animals are declining in condition, which would be expected because they're not feeding. But they're declining to a level which is really low before they start heading north, which makes me believe that the animals are getting very close to their starvation threshold. And some animals are going to have passed that threshold and end up dying before they get back. Something is most likely happening in the feeding grounds. So continued research up there to look at the condition of those animals is the most important, I think. And trying to correlate that with climatic effects and prey availability. Understanding how the Arctic ecosystem is affected by climate change and how this is affecting the prey of the grey whale will be very valuable in itself. From that, we can start making predictions of seeing how can we expect the population of grey whales to respond to this.
Now, we've all suffered from lockdown hair this past year, many of us longing for a trip to the hairdressers. So, spare a thought for the camels at London Zoo. Keepers had to give the molting animals a helping hand on the hottest day of the year so far. They brushed off a hefty 5.8 kilograms of fur to help the camels keep their cool as the mercury hit 28.6 degrees.
I think we should go there for our next trim. Our main stories again. Europe and the US have shelved a long-running trade battle as Joe Biden meets EU leaders in Brussels.
The UK and Australia have agreed a post-Brexit trade deal, but British farmers say they're worried about being undercut.
And Hungarians have packed into the Puskás Arena in Budapest, the only host city in Euro 2020 to allow full stadium capacity.
Well, that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
There's more on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're available to watch on smart TV apps such as Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV. You can also find us on YouTube and Dailymotion, as well as CGTN.com and the CGTN app.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. Meanwhile, from all of the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.